Yes, you have. Thank
Okay, thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Anna. So I have the honor of getting to introduce everybody to our wonderful next speaker and symposium organizer extraordinaire, Michelle. So I know we've heard a little bit about Michelle so far. You know that she works at Griffith and she is a wonderful PhD supervisor to both Anna and myself and a range of other people, some of whom are with us here today. She's our final presenter for the day and will be sharing on twice exceptional strength-based approaches, which is such a wonderful way to end our day. So Dr. Sorry, I messed that up. Michelle is a lecturer in inclusive education and special education in the School of Education and Professional Studies and a researcher with the Griffith Institute for Educational Research at Griffith University, Queensland, Australia. She's an internationally recognised award-winning researcher working for over 2 decades in the field of gifted education. And particularly in Twice Exceptional, she's made a significant contribution to advancing the knowledge in identifying and supporting exceptional populations in diverse learners. I'm sorry. Also, Michelle, if you're not aware, is one of the Australian delegates or the Australian delegate to the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children and has served as a member for the writing team for the World Council's Global Principles for Professional Learning in Gifted Education. If you haven't had a chance to check that document out, it is pretty phenomenal. So please join me in welcoming Michelle to present her session for today on Twice Exceptional Strength-Based Learning. Yay!
Thanks, Kaz, for that great introduction. So as Kaz said, I'm going to be talking about strengths-based approaches for twice exceptional learners. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Yugambeh and Kombumerri peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands from which I am speaking to you today. I recognise their continuing connection to the country, land and waters, and thank them for protecting this coastline, hinterland and its ecosystems since time immemorial. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. So as Kaz said in her introduction, I'm going to be talking about strengths-based approaches for supporting our twice exceptional learners. So I want to begin with a shared understanding. So what do we mean by twice exceptionality? What do we mean by giftedness? And how does disability fit into that? Then I'll move on to talking about identification of strengths and challenges and give you some different approaches from my own experience and some different bits and pieces from some of the assessments that we have generally at our fingertips, but with a broad view to actually looking at comprehensive assessment. So fitting in something like the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, into that comprehensive assessment approach, not as an end in itself. Then I'll talk about some strength-based approaches, what we mean by when we're talking about accommodating adjustments and remediating challenges or the impacts of disability on students' learning, and then some ongoing considerations. So in terms of that shared understanding and starting with that, probably about 10 years ago, if I was presenting professional development to a group of teachers or even academics for that matter, and I said, put your hand up if you've heard of twice exceptionality or if you've heard of GLD. Back then GLD was gifted learner with gifted with a learning disability. We've now moved on from that, but gifted learners with disability. I probably might get one hand go up, one person saying, oh yes, I've heard of that. Nowadays, I probably would be much rarer to have people not raise their hand to say, yes, I've heard about twice exceptionality. It is more probably recognised internationally, more research is being done internationally in the field of twice exceptionality, particularly from our friends and colleagues in North America. Some people have a preference here for using the term GLD, gifted learner with disability. Twice exceptionality is the term that I use because of my international collaborations and my dissemination of my research and the talks that I do in the field. And I've given you there Baldwin et al.'s 2015 definition of twice exceptional individuals. And like the definition of giftedness, it's changing, it's evolving as we learn more about talent development, as June was talking about this morning, wisdom, eminence, and working on creativity. We start to change our definitions of things like twice exceptionality. And of course,
excuse me, Michelle.
Yep.
I'm so sorry, but you're not screen sharing at this time.
Okay. Thank you for telling me that. I would have kept
No worries.
Okay, how's that?
Perfect. Thank you. We can see Garnier.
Okay. So in terms of that, what I was talking about before was the definition. So you can see Baldwin et al.'s definition up there. I'll just give you a minute, 10, 20 seconds to have a quick read of that. Sorry, apologies again for not sharing. I need a third screen. And they're referencing there the masking effect. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, which is a theory. So bear in mind that it is actually a theory. So I would think that everybody who's in the session today is familiar with Garnier's model. It's probably, well, I think Australia is probably the jurisdiction that has embraced this in terms of an overarching definition of giftedness. It does vary from state to state, territory to territory, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But if we're talking about Garnier's model and we're talking about giftedness and talent according to this model, then this is what we should actually be referring to. So as most of you probably know, we've got gifts on the left-hand side, or as he terms them, aptitudes in those different domains, mental domains, physical domains. And then on the other side in the green area, we've got competencies or talents. And then in the middle, we've got that very complex developmental process. So what's happening in terms of our environmental influences and intrapersonal influences or catalysts, as Garnier talks about these, and how's that impacting on that development process of gifts from the left-hand side into talent. And as we know, there are a lot of gifted people that don't necessarily become talented. And one of the things that Garnier talks about is that talent, eminence, wisdom, as we were hearing from the presenters this morning, can take a lifetime to achieve. So one of the mistakes that I repeatedly come across when people are talking about implementing or using Garnier's model as their defining model or what they're working through is they expect students to start at the beginning of school as gifted, and then by year 12, leaving school, they're talented. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. It's that lifetime approach. So who are the people who are going to be competent in these fields on the right-hand side in that green area? We don't know. So we're looking at eminence, we're looking at wisdom, we're looking at talent development. So in terms of defining twice exceptionality, my definition fits in with what Baldwin was talking about in 2015. I've been a bit more specific, bringing in some specific categories of disability, so autism spectrum disorders, ASD, dyslexia, ADHD, and so forth, and then giftedness, bringing in Garnier's 2020 definition there in terms of things like intellectual and creative. And then we use the term impairments, which comes more from the World Health Organization's understandings of the impact of disabilities. There's discussion often, if you've looked at psychologist reports, so WISC reports, that you might hear the term relative weakness and strengths. And I'll talk more about those as we go, but just keep those at the back of your mind. And then there's that understanding that twice exceptional students are very unique. So you've met a child with ASD or dyslexia or ADHD or combinations of those. You've met one child. Mix in giftedness into that goings on with our 2E student, and you've got a totally different presentation and understanding, which means support needs could be and probably are entirely different to another student who may have the same category diagnosis. So something really important to bear in mind. So often when we're talking about twice exceptionality, there's that predominant focus on disabilities, and we have that understanding around the medicalised model of disability. The NCCD tends to sort of lean towards that model as well. So does the NDIS. If you want to get support, you need to have paperwork, you need to have documentation of the impact of that disability on functioning. So in school, we kind of use that same model because that's what the systems are built on. And of course, that has problems. So disability categories, as I was talking about before, can have problems as well. We all come with bias, stereotypes, misunderstandings about what giftedness is, what disability is, and what particular categories of disability might look like. So we tend to talk about twice exceptionality in its simplest form as a combination of gifted, a combination of disability, one or more, what they term in the medical field comorbid. It's a horrible term. I don't like the term. It sounds like death. What it actually means is a disability that coexists alongside another disability or multiple other disabilities. So that's generally what that term comorbid means, just means co-occurring. So I found through my research that most often with a twice exceptional student, there's not just one disability, but there are multiple disabilities or multiple other things going on that perhaps don't fit into a category of one particular disability. You might look at what's happening and say, oh, yes, I can see, evidence of ADHD, but it's not enough to fit the DSM-5 criteria for that category, or there's evidence of ASD, but they don't quite fit there either. So in its simplest form, we tend to talk about these two things together, but it's not that straightforward. It's not that simple. So we're probably more talking about multiple exceptionality than we are about twice or dual exceptionality. And then if you consider other diversities, other equity cohorts, so Indigenous students, students from other cultural diverse backgrounds, students who've been impacted by trauma, students who live in rural and remote places, and so forth, you can see that conceptualization of multi-exceptionality is growing even bigger. And it's going to impact on each student differently, and each student is going to have different strengths that they're bringing to their learning. So it's more pervasive than that simple connection between disability or multiple disabilities and giftedness. And that's one of the things that sometimes is very difficult for people to get their head around it and really understand. I've got this category, this 2E twice exceptional student has come back with an autism diagnosis, they're gifted, but it doesn't look like autism, or I'm only seeing bits of that in there, or I'm seeing a huge evidence of ASD, but there's definitely something else going in there. So they present a paradoxical puzzle to teachers and their parents and themselves. So you've got that mixture, and recognizing that you've got that mixture and you're the individual that that mixture is impacting on, it's going to compound the problem even more. And if other people see you as a problem and see your learning as a problem and your behavior as a problem, you can imagine the load that that can put on some of these individuals. So this is a model I'm still working on. It's kind of in progress, but originally conceptualized in 2015. And you may or may not have seen this before. Basically, I've tried to conceptualize disability and giftedness. So bringing in those two areas to actually talk through what disabilities, with some examples of some categories of disabilities or some diagnoses of disabilities on that left-hand side. They are only examples, though by no means an exhaustive list. And then giftedness on the right-hand side there, drawn from Gagne's 2020 model, his DMGT. So one of the things to think about here is we've got twice exceptionality in the middle. My research has started to show that, and I've tried to illustrate this very crudely with this shape in the middle here, that there appears to be more twice exceptional students, more gifted students in the disability side of the model than there are gifted students with disability. So I'll say that again just to clarify a little bit more. There appeared to be more gifted students with disability. So we're kind of stretching that 2E more into the disability side than we are into the gifted side. And I'm not the only researcher that's actually noticed this. There are a couple of other people who've noticed it as well. So it's an interesting phenomenon that's going on that we don't understand. What we think might be happening is that we tend to have a deficit focus, and we tend to be fairly good at recognizing, categorizing, identifying disability, but perhaps not so much gifted. So maybe that's something that's skewing this. I don't know. It's an interesting thing that we're going to be working on and looking at finding out. Something else that also clouds our understanding of twice exceptionality is what's sometimes referred to as the intelligence disability dichotomy. And this is about a perception that giftedness absolutely cannot exist with disability. So giftedness and disability can't go together. They just can't. And I'll talk more about where this misunderstanding and this stereotype tends to come from in a moment. It probably has some foundations in this dichotomy, in that people can't reconcile their misunderstanding of disability, as in being unable, disabled, and giftedness as their understanding of being able. So I think this has some roots and foundations in that. So it's that division, that conceptual division between misunderstandings about both disability and giftedness. So I'm not going to argue one way or the other about whether certain disabilities can interact with giftedness or occur with giftedness, but there's more research that's needed to actually explore that and look at it. But I think at some level, especially when you're looking at things that are guiding psychologists in particular, medical professionals in particular, such as the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual 5, the DSM-5, that's when we come to look at things like intellectual disability. I'll talk more about that in a moment when I look at the bell curve. So as I mentioned before, there's this thing called the masking effect or the masking hypothesis. Sometimes we get a bit caught up in this, thinking that it's actually being proven, that there's actually evidence to suggest that this is really happening. But we don't have, or at least not as far as I'm aware, and I haven't seen anybody actually do any research about this hypothesis. But it sounds like it's probably happening, and it sounds like it makes sense. So 3 things could be happening. We've identified the disability, that diagnosis that I talked about before, that medicalized view, the categories of disability or category of disability, but giftedness hasn't yet been identified. That probably is the predominant category that you'll come across. We've identified the disability, but we haven't necessarily found any evidence about giftedness. And generally, it can stop there. The second one is giftedness is identified, but disability is not identified and may never be identified or might not be identified until they get to university or college, if indeed they go on to do that. And there's research to support that as well, that it can take years. They can be adults before they even find out that they're twice exceptional. And I know of many instances where that's happened. And then the third part of this hypothesis is talking about both giftedness and disability are identified or are unidentified. So we've got neither identified or we've got both identified. And I'll just put a little quote there on that right-hand side of the slide that often the journey to identification is non-linear and fraught with misdirection. So we know as teachers, parents, the children themselves, something's going on. We're not sure what it is. If we're really experienced, we might have an inkling about what's going on, but often they go off and get test after test after test, assessment, and gradually we might get some answers. So a lot of my research involving parents and twice exceptional students and teachers, it's a really non-linear journey that's quite expensive for a start. So that in itself limits identification. So if you haven't got the funds to be able to go out and find these exceptionalities, then you're going to run into issues there as well. So there's some equity issues around identification, which I'm sure you're all aware of as well, with giftedness and gifted education, as well as twice exceptionality and other areas of education. So what I talk about in my research in terms of how many, often we get this question, how many, what's the prevalence of 2E? Again, we're quite constrained by the data that is available to make any kind of very, I guess, clear, distinct cases for what the prevalence is. So I've done some work around estimates. It has a huge number of caveats around it. If you're interested in reading it, there's my 2020 article that I'll give you a reference to at the end of this presentation. One of the biggest caveats is that it's based on the NCCD population. So the caveats there require students to have interventions, adjustments in the classroom. So if a student with a disability isn't getting any adjustments in the classroom for whatever reason, they don't need it, they haven't been identified, whatever the reason might be, they're not counted in the statistics. There's other problems with the statistics as well. So my best guess, based on all of those caveats that I cover in that article, is that we've probably got a continuum of prevalence that is somewhere between 2 and 7%. And again, that is 2 to 7% of students identified with disability in the NCCD data, not necessarily all of school students. So just something else to bear in mind. But if we've got about 400,000 gifted students, according to Garnier's model, we're going to use that top 10%, then we could say that maybe we've got about 80,000 or more twice exceptional students. What my research and what other researchers, especially in North America, is actually pointing to is this is likely an underestimate. So some other researchers suggest that the upper end is likely close to 36% of students. That's a huge number. And when we're trying to attract funding, when we're trying to change policy, when we're trying to hopefully get some kind of legislative support for gifted students, for twice exceptional students, we have to use numbers. And as I said, these are the best guesses at the moment that I have. So these are the numbers that I'm using. So if somebody says to you, we don't have gifted students here, you can roll out some of these statistics and some of these numbers. We don't have twice exceptional students. Well, actually, you probably do. And depending on your context, will probably depend on the percentages. You may have more, you may have fewer, but it's unlikely that you'll have none at all. In fact, I'd probably say that's highly unlikely. I won't go too much into those statistics, but they're there for you to have a look at. And I touched on this earlier, that initial diagnosis, and again, we see that medical word there around diagnosis. So we talk about gifted identification, we talk about disability diagnosis. I've heard some people actually talk about gifted as being a diagnosis. The literature doesn't actually agree with that, but it's an interesting one when you're talking about twice exceptionality and you've got a diagnosis of 2E. I wouldn't say that. I would say you've got an identification of 2E. So an additional picking up of something going on, students undergone some assessments and they've come back with a diagnosis. What I've found is if the parents stop there, then sometimes that can do a disservice to the student and to their learning, because perhaps only that disability is recognised if you're thinking back about that masking hypothesis. But there might actually be other disabilities. And one of the things that I've actually found in my research is that anxiety across the students that I've worked with co-occurs in all of the students. So they might have been identified with ASD, with ADHD. They also got a diagnosis of anxiety disorder. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it's as a result of their twice exceptionality, if they're predisposed to it. We'd need some more research in that area. But having anxiety, as we know, can have a huge impact on learning. So you've got a student who's gifted, who's got multiple exceptionalities, multiple disabilities. They've got anxiety going on as well. There's all of this, and then we're saying, now we want you to learn this that's in the classroom in this way that we're teaching it. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. There's the other thing around misdiagnoses, and there's a well-known book on this topic itself. But what I'm referring to here is things like referring to Dabrowski's overexcitabilities to dismiss something like ADHD, for example. And you can do some, if you're not familiar with Dabrowski's overexcitabilities, just have a Google search when you get a moment, and you'll see why sometimes it can be used to dismiss something like ADHD. Or somebody will say, oh, I'm not seeing evidence of that in this situation. Well, that's okay. To meet the DSM-5 criteria is where the diagnosis comes from. So what we're thinking about here is labelling issues. So thinking about those stereotypes that I talked about before, or misunderstandings around labelling. That's what we've got to move beyond. So labelling gives us a starting point, but it can only take us so far because it comes with all of that baggage and assumptions around what a student with that label can and can't do. So it's often not suitable for 2E students with that same diagnosis. And then have a think about what some of the implications of that might be. So quite often when we're looking at assessments in terms of finding disabilities, in terms of identifying giftedness, we tend to focus on challenge areas, weaknesses. We're looking at adjustments that can be made. But it's also equally as important to look at what are the strengths about teaching to the strengths, compensatory strategies, remediation where possible, and I'll talk more about that as I go. And the DSM-5 talks about things like some of the learning disabilities need to have been evident for 6 months or more. So sometimes that might not necessarily say, yes, it's definitely been evident for 6 months or more, because the students learn to compensate. So something really important to be thinking about. So in terms of assessments, why do our 2E students sometimes get misdiagnosed or are misdiagnosed, as in they don't find what we're looking for, or we don't find anything? So it could be that assessment scores are average. So what you're seeing in the classroom in terms of results, NAPLAN results, and I recently wrote an article about NAPLAN results and some of the issues with those. Sometimes they show giftedness or examples of giftedness, and people jump to the conclusions that this child must be gifted. Other times that is evidence that they're high achieving but not necessarily gifted, a contentious issue. But what we find is 2E students sometimes tend to be average with their school results. So, for example, a student who's done a maths exam, 2E student, year 9, he's got all the really easy questions wrong and all the really hard questions correct. But then averaged out overall out of 50, it's 25, 26 out of 50. It looks like this student is average. They're C, they may be even a D, and sometimes even an E. So what do? Yeah, just keep cruising along, go, oh, this student's average. What is going on? We need to delve deeper into these kind of examples. Why is that student getting the easy questions incorrect? Is it that they're rushing through those to get to what they really want to do, which is the more challenging stuff? Is it that they are looking for something more challenging in those easy questions and they're not finding evidence of it, so they're just writing anything? What could be going on there? And it could be a million different things, but these are the kind of bits of assessment that we need to interrogate more to find out what's actually going on. What happens if I gave that test again and I didn't have any easy questions, they're all hard? The result might be 90%. It might be a totally different thing, or something else could happen, we don't know. So often there's that really enormous discrepancy between strengths, relative weaknesses, that you'll see that term on reports, what I like to call challenges. And their compensatory strategies, as I talked about before, can really inflate scores sometimes, or they're just too tired to be able to draw on those compensatory strategies, and they've just taken a nosedive on that assessment or that assignment that you've given them. So when we're talking about 2E students and looking for strengths, we should be comparing them to their own strengths rather than what's the norms for average students. And that's one of the things that Linda Silverman talks about quite a lot in her work. So sometimes we hear that children, as they get older, as they mature, their joints tend to stabilize a little bit more, especially if somebody's had joint hypermobility when they get to teenage years, early adult, joints can stabilize a bit more. It might be easier to hold a pen to write, those kind of things. So the compensatory strategies that they've learned along the way, they might not use anymore. And a really well-known person that you've probably all heard of, the airline Virgin man, he talks about how he employs people to do the things that he has difficulty with. Our children can't do that. They can't employ somebody to do those things. So we need to be considering things like remediation alongside their compensatory strategies. But one of the biggest issues that I come across with when we're saying, oh, you know, they're compensating for this, it's that extra cognitive effort. So we've got disability going on, we've got the impact of that disability in terms of learning, we've got anxiety going on, we've got impacts of giftedness, forced choice dilemma, all of those things. they can leave them quite physically and mentally exhausted. One of the things that time and time again parents say to me, especially for children in primary years, and it plays out differently in high school years, is that at the end of the day, their child just collapses in a heap. They either withdraw completely, or they're a crying mess, or they take some time at the end of the day just to decompress from that day's efforts. In high school, that could be things like what we term behavioural issues, or acting out, or total withdrawal. And often it has its roots in all this mental effort that's going on. I'm not painting a very nice picture here, but as we go, we'll talk more about strengths. But just think about some of the implications for learning that this might have. I've talked about medicalisation of 2E and disability. I won't talk too much more about that. But often we've got this caught between categories. So when we're in schools and we've got some of our well-meaning people in schools who go, oh, you know, this student's got ADHD. I know how to deal with this. I've dealt with this, you know, ad nauseum for years. But you've also got anxiety. You've also got giftedness, maybe some dodging work kind of behaviours going on as well, some acting out kind of things to avoid tasks and activities that they're not very good at. So, you know, pushing the person off the chair next to them if they're going to have to read out loud, or do some writing. So it might not necessarily align with the complexities of their profile is my takeaway from this slide. So let's have a look at some areas of strengths. And as you look at this slide, you probably think, oh, there's a lot here that talks about gifted, divergent thinkers, high general intelligence, extensive vocabulary, highly creative, inventive, focused in their area of interest. I have that little caveat there. Complex problem solvers. Some of these are probably setting off little light bulbs going, yes, that's a gifted trait. That's a gifted trait. So we've got the gifted traits. We've got the strengths. We've probably got some in there that might not necessarily be considered as what we talk about in terms of strengths. And then challenges. Very often related to either reading skills or writing skills, or both, attentional skills, working memory, information processing, language skills, and one that I've found time and time again, auditory processing issues. And some of you probably already know what that means. It's not hearing, it's how the brain is processing what a person is hearing. So if you're giving verbal instructions in the classroom and a child has auditory processing issues, they're probably going to remember maybe one or two of those, but by the time you get to the third or fourth, they've forgotten it. Or you're asking a question and everybody's raising their hand. You've got a response to that question. You ask another question. That child might still processing that first question. They raise their hand to answer the first question. You've now moved on to the second question. You call on them and they say the answer to the first one, and then everybody has a good laugh about that because, you know, that child wasn't paying attention. They were paying attention. It was the processing speed. It was that lag between processing what they've heard and then acting on it. So simple things like writing things, instructions up on the board, all those kind of things that I'm sure you all do. I'm preaching to the converted here. I'm just going to touch here on one of the things that we find when we talk about strengths-based is that there's a misconception or a misunderstanding that that's all we focus on. Forget about that they, you know, can't write very well, or their reading's not very good, or their comprehension's not very good. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about using their areas of strength, so that problem solving, that divergent thinking, to using that in the curriculum areas, in the activities, but also remediating their area of challenge, their area of difficulty. Sometimes that might be substituting writing for keyboarding, but sometimes if you're assessing writing, it can't be substituted. So we might consider things like extra time or responding to one main question instead of 3 minor questions, various things like that. And I'll talk more towards the end of the presentation about some more of those. So SLDs, specific learning disabilities and other disabilities, are lifelong. And as the DSM-5 says, the course and clinical expression are variable. Now that is variable for students who don't have 2E. So it's also variable for students who have 2E. It can depend on the interactions among the task demands of the environment and the range and severity of the individual's disabilities. So an individual's learning abilities or skills, comorbidity, so remember that word means coexisting other disabilities, are available support systems and interventions. So this is why remediation is really important. So if we've got issues with reading, fluency, comprehension, spelling, written expression, and numeracy skills in everyday life, that can persist into adulthood for people with SLDs. But we also need to be working on strategies to remediate and address those as much as possible. You still want to fill out forms by hand for the most part, still. Now I want to talk on a little bit more about finding strengths. So finding challenges, disabilities, and finding strengths, and then what to do with those. One of the really key things here, and this is specifically talking about intelligence testing, psychometric testing, and I'm going to talk more specifically about the WISC-5 in a moment. If there are really distinct differences between subtest scores on a test when you're reading a psychologist's report, and you've got an overall IQ score, the full scale IQ score, the FSIQ, it is actually invalid. So probably for me with twice exceptional learners, for the most part, I'm not saying for all twice exceptional learners, the FSIQ is probably not going to be very relevant in a lot of cases. And I've got an example of what I mean by that here. The bell curve, probably already all familiar with bell curve. And I think this is where that intelligence disability dichotomy has actually probably been born from in terms of the ends of the spectrum of the bell curve. So as I'm sure you all know, the right-hand side, or what's for me is the right-hand side, the 145 and up, we tend to talk about that as being the gifted end. The 70 and under on the other side, we tend to talk about, and the DSM talks about this, the DSM-5 in terms of intellectual disability and impairment. What we find, and these little stars are one twice exceptional child's results on a WISC-5 assessment. So these are the individual index scores. So you can see there the yellow one is below 70. It's 69, so only slightly below 70. But if we're saying 70 is an intellectual disability, then what's happening here for this processing speed? Working memory is still quite low, 88. So remember, average is 100 in the middle. Visual spatial, we're going up a little bit more here, so 105. But what we're really seeing strengths in here is fluid reasoning at 122 and the verbal comprehension at 144. Look at the spread and the gaps between those scores. These are supposed to be close together, just to give you a bit of perspective here. Average people, normal people, these are closer together with probably just a couple of points in between. For this one twice exceptional student, who at the time of testing, let me just scroll down to my notes, was 13.5 years old. They've been putting up with this and working with this and finding compensatory strategies for their whole schooling life until they've been 13 and a half. I'll just leave you with that thought. This is one student. So this is when we're looking at something like the WISC-5. If there's that large discrepancy among the index scores, it means that that full-scale IQ is uninterpretable. So we need to look at the index scores. And Linda Silverman's done a lot of work around this and delving down into those subtest scores as well. So if you get a chance, have a look at some of her work. She's done some terrific work, and she's actually fed that back to the designers of the WISC, and they've made changes according to what she's been finding in the Gifted Development Centre where she works. So you probably heard of the GAI, the General Abilities Index, and that's been known iterations the WISC for the WISC-3 in terms of the estimate of general intellectual ability for students who have that discrepancy between the index scores. It's less reliant on working memory, and it's less reliant on things like processing speed. So it may be a better overall representation, but again, I would still be drilling down and looking at what the index scores are, what the subtest scores are. So how are we going to be finding strengths for personalised learning? So that when we looked at previously, we've got some obvious strengths here: fluid reasoning, verbal comprehension. And you can have a look at those subtest scores on those. We've got some obvious impacts here in terms of processing speed and working memory. There's been some shift to the next thing up from the GAI, which is the Expanded General Abilities Index, or the Expanded GAI, EGAI, which actually drills down and looks at the subtest scaled scores. So there's 8 of these that it actually looks at. So it's looking at components that make up the verbal comprehension index. So things like similarities, vocabulary, information and comprehension, the VSI, Visual Spatial Index, so that's things like block design, and then fluid reasoning, which is matrix reasoning, figures and arithmetic. It doesn't include the working memory or the processing speed. So it's less reliant on what we call index scores with a low G loading. So that general intelligence loading is less in working memory and the processing speed, and higher in things like the verbal comprehension index. So I found in my experience that the WISC is a much more suitable test for describing and diagnosing and prescribing for twice exceptional learners, because it can show you, if you drill down and understand, and it's been done by an experienced assessor who's used to and knows about twice exceptionality and gifted students, you can drill down into those index scores and the subtest scores and get some really rich information that you can work with to use strengths. I just looked at the time. I need to accelerate a little bit. And as Linda Silverman says, IQ tests and results aren't an endpoint. They're tools that should be used to support informed observations. But on top of that, I'd go one step further and talk about things like comprehensive assessments. I talk more about this as well. So Linda Silverman talks about IQ assessment results nested into the schema. So the comprehensive assessment, they form part of it. They're not the endpoint in themselves. So an IQ test should never be looked at to dismiss giftedness. It's part of that comprehensive assessment, that broader picture. And that's why it's really, really important to have experienced assessors that can show that composite view of a child's abilities, their potential, what their strengths are, and what areas need remediating and more support. And what I mean by comprehensive assessment, and I've got 3 slides on this, so apologies, there's a lot of information, but you can take it away and read it. I won't go through all of it now because we're a bit pressed for time. But it's about really gathering information, evidence, data, what's the advanced or delayed early milestones, And you'll read in some of the checklists for early evidence of giftedness, oh, tick, 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 things like walked early, showed hand preference, right, left hand preference, those kind of things. I would take that with a grain of salt for some of our 2E learners, because the disabilities could have been evident from early on, but it forms a really important part of this picture that we're looking at, creating this comprehensive picture. Again, there's rating scales, checklists, screening with different tools, really good thing. And there's people in Queensland in particular doing some work with some screening tools and really good work with some screening tools for students at different stages of their schooling. It's about looking at those academic skills, but it's not about putting one above the other. So it's not about saying, oh, this student's done really well in NAPLAN. It's how does that fit into the overall picture of this student? It's about interpreting those kind of results cautiously, thinking about creativity, as Don was talking about this morning, consulting with other specialists, OT, speech pathologists, what kind of diagnostic assessments. And it's not about testing and testing and testing until the child is so sick of testing and they never want to go near another test. It's about trying to get to the bottom of it, but in a strategic as much as possible way. So considering evaluations, and one of the really important ones is auditory processing. So if you're noticing things like that in the classroom, that might be an indication. And usually it's the teacher that picks that up. I know parents, for one or another reason, might not be receptive to hearing it. But I think teachers are in a good position to be recognising things like that, vision issues, all those kind of things that we look at. Shelley talked before about the PAT tests, the Wyatt as well. She gave an example of the Wyatt 3 achievement test. So we're looking for lags or issues there that don't necessarily marry up with what we're seeing on something like the WISC results. But I want to put a caution around this in terms of filling every gap. One of the excuses that comes up time and time again about acceleration is, but they have gaps in their knowledge. And think about the example I gave before about the student who got all the easy questions wrong on the maths test, but all the hard questions correct. What are we going to say here? They've got gaps in the easy stuff, but no gaps in the hard stuff. So what I found from acceleration when it's been done well, we address those gaps when we get to it. So if a child is at the level where they can go and start doing quantum physics, but there's some maths gaps in there, we'll address those when we're working in quantum physics. And we can teach those skills at that point in time. And I think that's one of the really important things when we're talking about acceleration. It's not about filling every single gap. We all have gaps in our learning and what we know. I mean, I don't think there's a professional development opportunity that I've taken that I haven't learnt something from. And also recognising what I was talking about earlier, poverty, cultural differences, trauma, access to education, and those kind of things as well. And just a caveat around the WISC that sometimes it might not be culturally appropriate, so you might want to select a different assessment. And then, so we're talking about what are the strengths. We've talked about how we can identify strengths, how we can see areas of disability that are impacting on learning. And that giftedness first approach. So what are the strengths? How do we work with those strengths to support the areas of challenge? And this is a research project I'm still working on at the moment, and I'll just put the responses from parents and students into a word cloud so you could see what really comes out when I asked them what they saw as their strengths. So some of the things like creative and intelligent, they're smaller, so they didn't necessarily see those things as strengths. Technology interests, that was seen as a strength. Being a deep thinker, yeah, we could tick as a gifted trait. Investigator, divergent thinker, all of these things that we think about as strengths, students themselves aren't necessarily seeing as strengths. There's a bit of a mismatch there. So when we're looking at strengths that schools might recognise, my research has shown some of these kind of things, and I've tried to group them, and I recognise there's quite a bit of overlap across all these columns here, but I've tried to group them in different areas. So academic strengths, behavioural, emotional, and cognitive. So these are the kind of things that we want to see as educators, that my research is showing that educators want to see. So academic strengths relating to reading skills, writing skills, mathematical skills, behavioural strengths, that they're turning up, that they're putting in effort, that they're on task. Emotional strengths, resilient. The term resilient with twice exceptional children, I think, is overused. We tend to weaponize that a little bit with twice exceptional learners. And time and again, I've heard this used to say the child needs to be more resilient. You know, they're coming home at the end of the day and they're having that bit of a meltdown, or they're complaining that they're being picked on, or whatever it might be. These kids, for the most part, are highly resilient. They're going to school day after day with all these things going on. So to use that term resilient in that way, I think is doing a real disservice to a lot of our 2E students. And then we've got cognitive strengths, goal setting. We need to teach these things, especially to 2E students. They're told to revise, they're told to go study. Quite often they don't know what that looks like. And we get the same thing with gifted students. They've been able to just do it for a long time. And when they come across something that's hard or needs study, they don't know how to approach it. So really being explicit in teaching those type of study skills. What do we mean by summarizing? What do we mean by finding the important points? How do I do that? You know, is it a screen highlighter? Is it printing it out? Is it writing notes? What does that look like? And I see time is almost up. Some of the things schools are doing and doing really well. Some strengths-based approaches. And again, there's a lot on these next few slides. So these are your takeaways to go and have a look at and a read in terms of some suggestions around particular areas, in terms of challenges, and then some activities that can cultivate and honour strengths. So we're thinking about things like choice, interests, problem-based learning, a lot of those things that Shelley was giving us examples of as well. And I think I've got some ongoing considerations. Advocacy is huge. And exactly what you're doing today, professional development, professional learning, really, really important. Networking with other teachers, like-minded professionals, and trying to bring those maybe more reluctant teachers along that journey with you. And I know that there's a lot of people in the audience today that are actually doing some really good work in that area. So congratulations. And that brings me to the end. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing your wisdom with us today. I realize the thank yous meant to come after the questions, but I can repeat that. Now we have a whopping 60 seconds left of your question time.
Wow.
So yes, because you beautifully donated some of your session time to Shelley. We, Anna and I, made the executive decision to steal some of your question time for your presentation. So
that's fine. And I'm more than happy to answer questions afterwards. So we'll keep a record of all those questions, and whatever we don't get to now, we will definitely send out post-event.
Excellent. So yeah, we've got a copy, everybody, of your questions if you've sent them through on the Q&A or on the chat. So Michelle will be able to get back to you for them, so that we I love to see that people are happy to stay longer, but I don't want to force that on anybody, because I know just how important the end of the school day is. And I'm going to call it out. It's 10:45 p.m. for me. So I am pretty keen for bedtime. So thank you for that, Michelle. I know as a parent of a 2E kid and a teacher, I really, really appreciated a lot of what you had to say, and I learned a whole bunch. I do see that Robertson State School is keen to check out your PowerPoint. You'll be sharing that, correct?
Yep, absolutely.
Absolutely wonderful. So apologies for the no official Q&A for you. But I know that everyone will appreciate your written responses, and just thank you so much on behalf of everyone here, not just for what was an absolutely beautiful and really, really informative presentation, but also for your just dedication, not only to this event, but to gifted learners and twice exceptional learners in general for such a long period of time. You've been running this event for 4 years now, which I know is a lot of time and a massive commitment. And, you know, you present and you share your research and your dedication and your heart in this space. And it helps us all be better teachers and parents and just educators in general. So thank you so much. I can already see the thanks in the chat and the love hearts and the applause coming through. So super grateful to you, Michelle, for sharing wisdom and for making days like this happen.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate everybody being here. It's been great just to share the little bit that we were able to.